Lightbearer, The Crimson Chronicle, Part 1. Written by J.A. Hawk. Read for you by Joshua Garner.
Chapter 7. A Short Rest. Fate sank slowly into the hot water until only her nose poked out. It had been a hard couple of days. Rocky hills, thick brush, and mud. So much mud. She could feel the hot, soapy water itching the numerous scratches she had accrued on her arms and legs. Fate breathed deeply of the sultry air and tried to let her tension fade into the steam. In the past 3 days, they had traversed a great stretch of the Yonder countryside, and now they neared the feet of the Vernola Mountains. Once they reached the mountains, the air would turn bitter and the paths treacherous. It was something they would have to account for, but right now, the small squat inn, with its warm lights and hot water, were all that mattered to Fate. The prospect of a real bed and hot food was a welcome reprieve from huddling in the copse with just a blanket and a rucksack for a pillow. Fate heard the latch of the door rattle and the slow creak of hinges. "Someone's using the bath," she called, hoping they would leave and come back later. However, the soft click, click of claws echoed off the tile floor as the newcomer maneuvered towards the other copper tub. Fate groaned softly to herself and squeezed her eyes tighter together. The baths were not, strictly speaking, private in an inn this small, but she had enjoyed the quiet solitude of the steamy air. Water sloshed as the other patron got into the large copper tub a bit too recklessly and spilled water onto the floor. Fate opened her eyes a crack and stole a glance at the other tub. The grinning face of a shaggy fox was staring right at her. "Fletch!" Fate shrieked. She scrambled to grab a towel from the bronze stand next to the tub, subsequently sending brushes and soap clattering to the floor in her haste to cover herself. "What are you doing?" she accosted him. "I'm not wearing anything." Fate could feel the blood rising to her face and feel her ears going violently red. "We used to bathe together all the time," Fletch said nonchalantly. He squeezed a spongeful of soapy water over his head. "We were children," she replied indignantly. Fletch cocked an eye at Fate. Soapy suds clung between his shaggy ears. "You had fur then, you have fur now," he said plainly. Fate could only gape. "Just a few more curves since then," he added with a sly smile. Fate could now feel the heat positively radiating off her face and a slight pounding in her ears. "This sure beats washing in Crooked Creek, though," Fletch observed as he wrung out another sponge of water over his head. His ginger fur turned the deepest brunette color. "Why not use your own bath?" Fate asked. She sunk even further down into the tub to make sure she was completely covered by soap suds. Broken," Fletch replied, waving his paw carelessly. "Or so Madame Jolin says. I told her it wouldn't be an issue." "You're unbelievable, you are," Fate said nonplussed, shaking her head. "Turn your head. I'm getting out." Once Fate was sure Fletch's eyes were totally closed, she got out of the tub and wrapped herself tightly in a towel. Slightly annoyed with the smirk that still played across the fox's face, she gathered her things quickly and hurried across the wet floor, taking care not to slip. Fate had just reached for the door when suddenly a cold, wet sponge hit her square across her bare back. Eep! She let out a sharp squeak as icy water ran down her spine. In a rush, she threw open the door, jumped into the hallway, and slammed the door shut. Peals of laughter emanated from the other side of the bathroom door. Fate intoned, annoyed. She stood in the hall for a moment, breathing heavily and drying her ears. However, her annoyance was short-lived as the laughter slowly subsided from behind the door, and she too was reminded of a simpler time. A time when adventures into the countryside left Fletch and her covered head to paw in mud, fur completely matted, with briars tangled so deeply that they wouldn't come out for days. Some time later, after they had both become Lightbearers, well, not much had really changed if she was honest with herself. "Idiot," Fate said softly. She smiled to herself and hurried off towards their rooms. Fletch was seated in the common room of the Whistling Wolf, close to the fire at a round table. Clean and neatly brushed, his fur shimmered copper red in the flicker of the flames. His tail, instead of a bushy mess, was tidy and lavish. He wore fresh brown trousers buckled at the knee with brass snaps, a white long-sleeved shirt made of a hardy wool, and lastly a fine red smoking vest which buttoned up the front. Fletch took a splinter of wood from the fire and relit a long clay pipe which he had borrowed from the tavern keeper. He had broken off the tip of the stem to have a fresh mouthpiece, and a few puffs later he sat back in a cloud of aromatic pipe weed and watched the room fill slowly with patrons. On the bar sat pewter beer mugs lined up in a row. Each mug was only 3/4 filled. As a patron wandered in, they would stop, order a mug, and slap down a few coins. Then the young wolf who minded the bar would take one of the mugs, go to a keg, twist open the spout, and fill the rest of the mug up, putting on the head before giving over the frothing beer. Fletch relaxed and contently watched the procession of steady patrons who filtered in. Yet he noted the excessive amount of custom, for it was still quite early in the afternoon. After a while, Felix joined Fletch at his table. The prince was freshly cleaned as well. He wore a cream-colored long-sleeved shirt that was a little too big for him, and hung loose. His left paw had been wrapped in fresh linen bandages and completely hid the ashen fur beneath. Fletch noticed the bandage now reached halfway up the youth's forearm. When Felix saw him looking at the paw, he pulled the loose sleeve down, hiding it from view. Fletch thought it best to say nothing. He offered the clay pipe toward Felix, who declined with a small shake of his head. "Wow," Fletch said genteelly, rising to his feet as Fate suddenly joined them. She wore a long, thick woolen dress of green, open in the back. Her fur was marvelously white, and the firelight tickled out the golden spots on the back of her neck. Both her ears were tied with ribbons of bright red that dangled down, and at her neck she wore a simple matching choker of ribbon. "Thanks," Fate said with a pretty smile. Fate started to sit when the busty and curvy shape of a she-wolf bustled over. The wolf was middle of years, her fur was light gray, and she wore a simple dress of white with rolled sleeves. A plain brown leather corset was tight around her middle. Each of her ears were pierced with 2 golden hoops, and she wore golden bangles around her wrists that clinked and tinkled when she moved. "Look at you, my dear," the wolf said in admiring tones. She grabbed Fate by the paws and displayed her from side to side. "You're as pretty as a shooting star on a summer's eve, you are." The wolf's accent was quick and heavy, indicative of the white mountains of the north, with a distinguishing clipped roll of the tongue. "Thank you, Madam Jolin," Fate said in a gracious tone. "It fits wonderfully." "And you nary clean up half bad yourself," Jolin said, casting a critical eye at Fletch. "And you, young master," she added, her eyes flicking towards Felix. "Madam," Fletch said with a small bow, his paw over his chest. Fletch cast a wary eye around before he leaned in close to Jolin and whispered something into her ear. Jolin's eyes became wider with every word Fletch spoke. "Oh," she said in sudden realization as Fletch finally broke away. There was an air of pure excitement about her for a moment. Then she seemed to gather her senses again and looked around at all of them. "Button, you must be hungry," she asked briskly. She turned and gazed around, searching for someone. "Rory, Marianne," she called. "Where is that silly-headed vixen?" Jolene bustled off towards the bar, shooing patrons out of her way as she went. Fate and Fletch laughed good-naturedly as they watched Jolene cut a path towards the bar. Once the matron arrived, she reached over and caught hold of the young wolf behind the bar and whispered quickly into his ear. The young wolf's eyes also went wide as he looked down at Jolene, stunned at what he was hearing. Letting go, Jolene pushed the barkeep slightly to get him going, and the young wolf disappeared quickly out a door set behind the bar. Fate and Fletch both took their seats, and the three of them looked at one another in silence, drinking in the pleasant feeling of the common room with chatting patrons all around. Soon, a young vixen approached their table with a tray full of pint beer mugs. She also wore a simple white dress with her sleeves rolled. The beer frothed wildly over the edges of the pewter beer mugs as she thumped them down in front of them. But in addition to the beer, she carefully placed down 3 fine glasses. 2 of the glasses were filled with a dark crimson wine, but the third had a bright yellow liquid. This one she specifically placed in front of Fletch. "Something special from the house?" the vixen said softly. Her bright eyes lingered long on Fletch before she slowly moved away. Fate picked up her glass and drank, as did Felix. Fletch stared at the yellow liquid for a moment in contemplation. Finally, he picked it up and tried it. "Jolene, you devil," Fletch laughed under his breath. He tapped the glass with the tip of his claw, which gave off a soft ring. "Mead." They drank for a time, contented by the warmth the spirit spread through their weary bodies. Before long, the young vixen was back, this time with a tray full of food, which she placed out before them. They had a freshly baked white loaf with a crispy crust, butter, clotted cream, pickles, a good hard cheese, thick slices of roasted boar, and lastly, honey. The vixen placed the jar of honey next to Fletch's paw very deliberately, and then stood there somewhat awkwardly looking down at him with very large eyes. Fletch busied himself sorting out the plates of food around the table, determined not to make eye contact. "Thank you," Felix said, drawing the girl's attention. "Just shout if you want anything else," the vixen said sweetly. She glanced once more at Fletch before disappearing into the commotion of the common room. "I think our young serving maid is taken with you," Fate said to Fletch. "Don't think I haven't noticed," Fletch replied in a low tone. He looked to where the maid stood waiting on another set of customers. She shot a brief glance towards their table again. "Well?" Fate said in a mischievous tone. Her glass of wine was already empty. "No harm in having a bit of fun?" She nudged Fletch under the table with her foot and gave him a sly grin. "No," Fletch said slowly. He picked up some bread and slathered it with butter and honey. "It would do much harm, I'm afraid. I understand her curiosity. There are few of us on these shores. But I would not give her hope where there is none. I could not be that cruel. Once she found out what I was." Fletch fell into silence, eating slowly of the bread. Fate watched Fletch keenly until he noticed and looked up at her. His gaze was piercing, fixed, and completely on her. Fate gave a small, sad smile, then began to eat as well. The food disappeared quickly between the 3 of them. Few words were spoken, except to pass a particular morsel. Once they had finished, and the tankards had begun to get low, Jolene wandered over again. The she-wolf carried a lit oil candle made of a crockery which she placed carefully at the center of the table. Exceptional praise was given upon the quality of the food and ale, to which Jolene smiled appreciatively. "Why so many, Jolene?" Fletch asked. He nodded at the tables now, completely stuffed with patrons. "'Tis the autumn harvest festival, me dears. And these'ns," Jolene jerked a thumb at the packed tables, "will have any excuse to skive off early." Unexpectedly, The walls of the inn shuddered violently from a mighty blow. The noise sounded as if it had come from the cellar below, and many of the patrons went quiet, looking round for the source of the disturbance. Rory, the young wolf, slid in from the door behind the bar. His face was very pale. Jolin, seeing this, looked down knowingly at Fletch. "Gavin!" Jolin suddenly shouted at the top of her voice. Gavin, an enormous black hair, jumped at the sound of his name and hit the table where he sat, sending the pints atop it to tip and totter. "Steady!" each of his mates yelled, grabbing at the mugs as beer splashed all over the place. "I thought I told you to watch where you put your big hoppers," Jolin shouted. Collectively, the common room began to laugh, apparently forgetting the odd sound of a moment before. "Begging your pardon, madam," Gavin said, looking ruffled. He apologized profusely to anyone who would listen. "Go on, pay for it then. Give us a tune," Jolin replied, to much cheering from the room. Gavin grinned sheepishly and reached towards the wall where a fiddle and bow hung. The instrument looked comically small against the hare's huge paws as he took it down. Gavin's large foot began to tap a jaunty beat. It thumped hard against the wooden floor like a bass drum. Then he began to saw the bow across the fiddle strings, and cheers went up all around as music filled the room. Jolin listened to the tune for a moment with satisfaction. Then her foot began to tap to the beat. Next, she bounced slightly on the spot. Jolin's enthusiasm grew until she couldn't stand it anymore, and she grabbed Fletch by the paw and hauled him up from his chair into the center of the room. Fate laughed gaily as she saw the surprised look on Fletch's face. But he took it in stride, and he and Madame Jolin began to dance sprightly to the song. Fate clapped along merrily as the two danced around. When they passed by, Fletch reached out a paw and caught Fate and dragged her onto the floor as well. More patrons were joining in, and on the next round, Fate caught Felix and pulled him reluctantly onto the floor. Soon, a clear voice rose loud from the den. Then another joined in, then another. The song was clearly a favorite of the Whistling Wolf, and the lyrics were well known by all. There once was a drake from Natty Head. He was told of a pub by a tricksy hare. She said to him, "Ho, you there, my beer's as brown as your daddy had. Won't you come in if you dare?" The drake was proud, he paid the fare. He drank and drank till he thought he flew. The hare said to him, "Why your scale so blue?" He tipped and he swayed, their panic grew. They thought and thought, none knew what to do. "Now hold there, son, don't you spew. I thought that drakes could hold their brew." The song ended with many a laugh. Most of the dancers on the floor headed back to their mugs or to get more from the bar. "Whew, what a toe tickler," Jolin said as she fanned herself vigorously. She shouted across the room, "Oi, Gavin, give us a breather. Marianne, show us your pipes, girl." Jolin stopped the group before they could go back to their table. "I think I need to cool off in the cellar," she said in a low voice, giving Fletch a knowing look. "Perhaps you'd all like to join?" Gavin began a slow, melodic progression with the fiddle, and Marianne, with many a cheer of encouragement from the locals, went to stand next to the giant rabbit. When all eyes were locked upon the young vixen, Jolin quietly stepped behind the bar and opened the door to the cellar. She beckoned the group inside. Fate and Felix disappeared into the dark doorway. Fletch stopped for a moment as the vixen began her first verse. Lovely voice," he said, then turned away and hurried into the dark cellar. "Rory, bring a haunch down, won't you?" Jolin instructed as she maneuvered inside the doorway. "Yes, Mum," Rory replied and headed towards the kitchens. The cellar passage was dark and cool. Jolin closed the door behind her and threw them into darkness, except for a soft light which emanated from below. Bit of well-earned privacy, Jolyn said. She weaved her way between them and headed down the stairs. They followed her to the bottom, where she turned the corner and came up short. Edek's massive body, wet from apparent rain, was curled tightly below. He lifted his head as they came into view. "Save me," Jolyn said in a hushed, adoring tone. "Look how big you've gotten. I'll need a new Sarah next time you come round." Jolyn approached Edek without fear and took his massive head in her paws. She gripped tightly at the spikes on either side of his jaw and pulled his large nose into a tight embrace. Edek allowed it, but recoiled slightly, a rare look of embarrassment crossing his hard eyes. "Hey, what are you on about?" Jolyn asked suspiciously as the drake shied away from her. "Madam Jolyn," Edek said, his head turned towards the wall of the tight cellar. A large cupboard had once stood there, but now only a pile of splinters and broken crockery remained. Jolyn looked at the mangled remains. "Oh, tosh," she said, giving Edek's horn head a little shake before letting go. "Never mind that. The gaudy thing is better as firewood anyway. Me brother never had any fashion sense." The door creaked open from above, and Rory made his way laboriously down the stairs. Jolyn's face broke into a huge smile. "Oh, I got something for you," she said, casting an excited look at Edek. Come, over here, Rory," Jolyn urged and pointed in front of Edek. "Peppered boar, you like it? Has a real kick." Rory struggled into the light, carrying what looked to be an entire rear haunch of meat on a huge bone. It was coated thickly with spice and was well charred. Rory placed the heavy load at the feet of Edek and stepped back. Edek's head lowered and he sniffed interestedly. Effortlessly, he grabbed the massive haunch in his huge teeth and placed it to the side. "You show much kindness," Edek rumbled. Another cheer from above echoed down the stairwell. Marianne had clearly finished her song to the delight of the bar. In fact, they were thumping and whistling, calling for another, as well as shouts for more beer. "Ah, fury burn them," Jolyn said quickly. "Rory, get up there before they rip the kegs off the walls." She shooed him away quickly. Rory gave a quick wave to all of them, then hurried back up the stairs to the common room. "Preposterous, you know," Edek commented, watching the young wolf recede up the stairs. "What's that now?" Jolyn asked curiously. "We can hold our brew," Edek snorted, dignified. Jolyn, Fate, and Fletch all grinned. "Naturally," Jolyn replied with a twinkle in her eye. "Only a fool would think different." She gave Edek a pat on the nose. Felix was watching this transaction with complete awe. He stared at Jolyn with curiosity apparent. Finally, it must have gotten the better of him because he asked, "Who are you, mistress?" "Don't you know my name by now?" Jolyn asked in a mock chastisement. "With all the fools up there shouting it at me all the time." Jolyn settled herself down on the straw next to Edek's large clawed foot. "More importantly, me young master, what brings a prince to my doorstep?" Felix looked around at Fate and Fletch quickly, as if he'd been caught. Fate and Fletch had both agreed that for no reason should the prince be openly known as of yet. Fletch, however, only grinned appreciatively and leaned against the wall. I guess who you are," Jolyn said in a knowing voice. "What else could garner the attention of two Lightbearers and a large friend here? Come now, let's have it all." Fate joined Jolyn on the straw floor and began their tale. The story was told quickly, with Fletch interjecting facts here or there. Jolyn sat in quiet contemplation and listened without interrupting. However, when Fate came to the part about Felix's illness and their plan to tackle the mountains as soon as may be, Jolin stopped her and asked the prince to show his injuries. The prince did so reluctantly. He unwrapped his hurt arm and showed the ring and the twisted flesh of his paw entangled about it to Jolin. "Vernola Mountain," Jolin said thoughtfully. "And you think these waters can help?" "Yes, our most powerful healing techniques use the waters of Yulfron," Fate replied. "But they are rare, and it loses its efficacy quickly once it leaves the mountain, so we really must go to them." "Well, I don't know much about healing myself, outside the powers of a stiff drink," Jolin said. "I can supply you with food, and you can stock up on supplies here in the village. You're lucky as well. The Harvest Festival is in a few days, so all the vendors are absolutely stuffed. You should be able to find winter gear aplenty." "What of armaments?" Fletch asked. "I have some chain that needs repair." "Well, Gavin should be able to help. He's run the forge when any work need be done, since me husband passed his." Jolin fell into a moment of quiet retrospective. "We used to say he had the brawn, and I had the booze. Quite the duo we were," she sniffed heartily. "Anyway, Gavin's pretty nifty with those big furballs he calls pulls. He'll see you're the right." "Felix could do with some protection, too. Are there any who sell steel?" Fletch asked. "No, not since the king started regulating the forges." Jolin stopped herself. "However," she shook her paw thoughtfully, and her bangles clicked wildly as she grasped at a memory. "I think Silver did leave something here." Jolin got to her feet and gripped Edek, who offered his large head for support as she rose. "Thank ye, hun." Jolin patted Edek gratefully and disappeared into a dark corner of the cellar. Loud bangs and crashes issued as Jolin shifted detritus around as she searched for something. When she emerged, she held a long object wrapped in a cloth, which she handed to Felix. The prince uncovered a simple arming sword in a scabbard made of plain leather wrapped with a belt. "Might need Gavin to put an edge on it, but it should do in a pinch," Jolin observed critically. Thank you. But why does an innkeep have a sword?" Felix asked, confused. "Madame Jolin is sister of our mentor, Master Silver. It must be one of his old blades," Fate explained. "Aye, that's right. I've near enough raised these two," Jolin said, looking fondly at Fate and Fletch. "In and out all the time during their training years. And then there's this one. Well," Jolin ended fondly, scratching the soft skin behind the jaw of Edek's head. Edek half closed his eyes as Jolin tickled the perfect spot. "Have you had any word from Silver?" Fletch asked. "No, he's been rather quiet for a while now," Jolin said softly. "I'd hoped you could tell me something of him." Fletch shook his head slowly, and a silence fell upon them. The aroma of the spiced meat permeated heavily in the tight cellar. Edek licked his nose and mouth with a slight smacking sound, but determinedly kept his eyes forward. "Oh, never mind," Jolin said as she noticed Edek's eagerness to eat. "Look, we best be getting back up. As for you, young Felix, we'll need to do something about your fur. I'll try to conjure up some ebony roots. That should darken you up. Most of them above were near enough sloshed when they came in, but go roaming around town looking the way you do, and word'll start to spread." Felix touched his fur self-consciously. "Why should I hide who I am?" he asked. Fate looked slowly between Fletch and Jolin for a moment before turning towards the prince. Sincerely, she said, "Felix, we want to get you healed. That's our duty to you as Lightbearers." "You have not the time," Edek interrupted brusquely. He reached forward and poked his sharp claw into Felix's hurt arm. The prince winced horribly and nearly dropped the scabbard. Jolin cast a thoughtful eye over Felix. Listen here, the lost prince returning will be more than a 2-week wonder. Once it comes out, you won't be able to move about freely anymore, she said. Perhaps you're right, Felix panted. He gripped his arm tightly, and his pained expression was slow to recede. Very well. Do with me what you will. It's settled then, Jolin said. Let's leave Edek to his dinner. Plus, I fancy another pour from that mead. What say you, Master Fletch? Jolin happily looped her arm through one of Fletch's and began to head back up the stairs with the fox in tow. The rest of the group followed as the sounds of vigorous ripping and chewing filled the cellar. It was late morning when Fate finally awoke. The consumption of good spirits and a comfortable bed were powerful sedatives. At first, Fate was slightly shocked to find a dark brunette rabbit in Felix's bed. Madame Jolin had clearly found and boiled some ebony root for the prince. The matron must have pulled him away while she and Fletch had enjoyed the gathered rowdiness of the common room. Prince Felix's uniquely cinnamon fur was now a dark enough shade of brown to pass for any old buck in the kingdom. However, the dye had failed to take on his injured arm. The fur remained the same ashen gray color as it had before. Felix continued to wrap the arm with linen, and it did well enough to cover the mark. Both the prince and Fletch were busy about their room, in which they had all shared through the night. They were both fully dressed and ready for the day. Felix was buckling on his borrowed sword, and Fletch was pulling his rent shirt of chainmail from his travel pack. They took their leave of Fate with a wave and headed for the common room. Fate got up, dressed, and shortly joined the others. Today she wore another borrowed dress from Jolin. It was a simple black dress that had decorative cuts along the sleeves, which accented Fate's white fur with beautiful contrast. Then, about her waist, she had belted her short sword. Together they ate a quick meal of cold chicken in the common room, served by a very haggard and bleary-eyed Rory. Apparently the revels of the night before went well past their retirement to their rooms. Once they were finished, they said their goodbyes and made their way into town. Their first business was to call on Gavin, the large black rabbit who Jolin had mentioned the night before. A task easier said than done, unfortunately, for the streets were thick with townsfolk. Most had the look of locals attempting to peddle off their wares to anyone close enough to hear, while others had the look of outsiders with the mind to do the exact same with their imports. The Harvest Festival had attracted all manners of entrepreneur from the surrounding area ready to trade and barter. A sense of excitement and eagerness filled the air. Fate, Fletch, and Prince Felix were quite overwhelmed at first, content to walk amongst the various stalls and just observe the wide range of goods, sometimes making mental notes if they came upon something enticing. However, they did have a pressing matter to attend to, and after inquiring about Gavin, some of the local townsfolk directed the three of them in the right direction. They dodged through the multitudes of crowded streets until eventually they heard the familiar ting and ping sounds that only hammers make upon anvils. They followed the telltale noise until they came upon a giant black hare tinkering around a forge and making a bit of a show of doing very little. In fact, the coals had the look of only having just been lit. Bright flames still looked high at the coal instead of the dull, ruddy glow tempered for forging steel. "You Gavin?" Fletch asked as they approached the forge. The large black rabbit looked up from where he sat on a round stump of a log. He had been working a small kitchen knife over a whetstone. "No," the rabbit replied shortly. Jolin said that Gavin worked the forge," Fate said, slightly confused. "Aren't you the fiddle player from the Whistling Wolf?" She looked around the forge quickly to see if anyone else was perhaps just out of sight. "Ah, you want that, Gavin?" the rabbit said slowly. He checked the edge of the knife.
Yes, please, Fate said sweetly. Could you perhaps get him?
Well, I guess you found him after all, Gavin replied with a wry smile. A look of utter confusion crossed Fate's face. She looked at the large black rabbit, then turned uncertainly towards Fletch. He's messing with you, Fletch said simply to Fate. Gavin beamed kindly at Fate, who still looked somewhat perplexed. Do you have the means to mend this shirt? Fletch asked. He placed his chainmail down on a work table and stretched it flat to show the damage across the ripped shoulder. Also, we have a rather longer knife for you to sharpen. Fletch jerked his thumb at Felix, who removed the arming sword from its sheath and placed it on the table beside the chainmail. Gavin reached forward and grasped the arming sword. He turned it from side to side quickly, then let it fall. Next, he leaned forward and took the torn chainmail and examined it closely between his thick fingers. This is good steel, and a decent weave pattern. Single rivet. What in blazes could have done that? Gavin asked, placing the shirt back down. Something very strong, Fletch said casually. Right. I take your meaning. Don't poke your nose where it isn't welcome, Gavin said shortly. Well, I got some steel rings here. The rabbit removed a box of tight metal rings and a set of pliers from under the table. End of a grindstone for the Drake sticker there. He nodded towards a large stone grinding wheel set in a vertical brace attached with a rotation handle. Come here, lad, Gavin said, motioning towards Felix. Spin that wheel and I can put an edge on it right now. The chain will take a few hours. Gavin rose, took the sword from the table, and moved towards the grinding wheel. Felix joined him and grabbed the handle of the stone wheel and rotated it. Keep it a nice, even speed, Gavin instructed. After a few moments and a shower of sparks later, Gavin moved back, satisfied. Felix was sweating after laboring at the heavy stone wheel and stepped back panting with his paws resting on his hips. That'll do, Gavin said as he tested the edge of the sword, then handed it to Felix. It'll be 20 crowns for the shirt and a few hours at best. Fine, Fletch said. He removed the coins from a pouch and placed them into the large rabbit's paws. It'll have a lifetime guarantee when I'm finished, Gavin said proudly as he tucked the coins away and picked up the chain shirt. Of course, that's my lifetime, not yours. Gavin chuckled and sat back down with his box of steel rings and began to replace the broken rings of the chainmail with new ones. He weaved the small round circles of steel in and out of the chain shirt with a deft paw, then would close the ring with pliers. Suddenly, he looked up at all of them with a cocked eye. Still here? He asked gruffly. Fletch laughed. Right, we'll be off. The next few hours were spent amongst the town, dipping in and out of shops and stalls. The entire town was a beehive of activity, and only getting busier. Large caravans kept trundling in by the worn thoroughfare, loaded high with goods of every sort. The first time this happened, Felix stopped dead, staring wide eyes as a huge covered wagon full of vegetables passed by. It was being pulled by the most unusual creature. Harnessed to the front of the wagon, by a heavy yoke, was a boar of incredible size. The creature was as large as Edek, with huge tusks that stretched back over his head, with edges that looked quite deadly. What's wrong? You don't have tuk-tuks in the capital? Fate asked when she saw the shocked look on the young prince's face. No, there are the Pride Lancers. Sometimes they will hook them to carts, Felix said as he marveled at the massive tuk-tuk. A scrawny rabbit leading the wagon pulled heavily on an iron ring attached through the tusk of the creature. The huge animal gave a grumbling snort and turned at the pressure. With each new step it took, the creature made an annoyed tuck-tuck grunting sound. Those big cats are good for speed and rather useful when getting into a scrap, Fletch said. But when it comes to real work, they need something a little hardier out here. He pointed at the head of the creature. The trick is to control the tusk. Point the head in the right direction and all the rest will follow. The day tarried on while Fate, Fletch, and Felix made their way through the busy markets hunting supplies. Madame Jolin had been correct. After canvassing the town once over, they were able to pin down which shops had what they needed for their venture into the cold mountains. It was the end of autumn in the valley, but amongst the peaks of the Ver Nola Mountains, winter would already be in full effect. From the shops they were able to purchase a heartily built pack, as well as an oiled cloak for Felix, 3 heavy deerskin coats lined with wool, a pair of thick gloves and foot wrappings for each, as well as double-layered long woolen cloaks with deep hoods. Lastly, they bought a large pair of saddlebags, usually meant for tuk-tuks. Edek might take offense at the notion of carrying supplies, but they would be needed once they got to the higher altitudes where food and firewood would be harder to scavenge. Their funds now dangerously spent, they decided to splurge the last of their coins on a street vendor peddling what he claimed was a delicacy from Metagauze. The small, sandy-colored rabbit was selling strange little fried dumplings attached to skewers. The dumplings were filled with either a ground meat paste or a grilled vegetable, which he would fry in a vat of oil over a fire. They were quite delicious, if not completely genuine to the style served in the City of the Sun. They sat eating the dumpling skewers and watching the crowd swell in the small town, every face eager for the coming harvest festival. Fletch finished his skewer first and said he was off to collect his chainmail from Gavin at the forge. Felix decided to go with him, stating that he needed a replacement buckle for his worn scabbard and hoped the blacksmith had a replacement one. Fate was content to sit with their purchases until they returned and bid them farewell. Sitting and watching was welcome after the hard day of haggling they had suffered under the administrations of the many shopkeepers keen to turn a profit. The sun had nearly set. It cast a golden light over rich fields, most of which had already been harvested. Fate sat atop a pile of their collected goods and watched the breeze play amongst the long stalks of wheat. She found it hard to believe that the country might be on the edge of war. It seemed so peaceful here, a stark contrast to the city where conflict seemed to breed around every corner. However, if their informant in the capital was to be believed, the peace balanced upon the edge of a knife. Fate felt guilty not confiding more of the situation to Prince Felix, but she agreed wholeheartedly with Fletch. Sometimes the best argument one could make was proof. It was a somewhat abrupt method, but the results were usually good. She did not want to keep Felix in the dark, but how did one approach the topic that Felix's brother, the king no less, was persecuting the very order the prince was supposed to champion as the Crimson Bearer? The situation was fraught with difficulty. Prince Felix had not been properly trained in the values of the order, despite being the Crimson Bearer. Would he even take their side once he knew the truth? Lightbearers were being forced into servitude, at the peril of their families if they tried to refuse. Outcasters. The very notion made Fate sick to her stomach. Of course, none of that would matter if the prince keeled over in the meantime. She tried not to show it, but Fate was extremely worried about the prince. She had never seen an ailment the like of which he carried. It seemed to have such minimal impact on the patient, but something felt wrong about it. It had a darkness about it. A cart moved onto the worn path in the distance. Fate shaded her eyes and glanced down the road in the direction where the forge was. Neither Fletch nor Prince Felix were to be seen. Perhaps the forge master was giving them more of his unique approach to dealing with customers. Fate shook her head, remembering the large black rabbit. If given time, she believed she would come to enjoy his eccentric behavior. It was a shame they could not stay for the harvest festival. The entire town was a powder keg of excitement, not only about the large feast, but the apparent merriment to come, resplendent with singing, dancing, music, food, and beer, all to be had aplenty. However, speed was of the essence now, more than ever, and Fate would not risk the prince even a day if she could help it. The lone cart in the distance worked its way slowly towards town, silhouetted harshly by the low sun. The driver of the cart cracked their whip, urging their beast to greater speed. Fate closed her eyes, drinking in the last rays of the nearly extinct sun. Whatever may come, she would get the prince to the waters of Yulfron. She thought of the high passes of Varinola set before them. She had traversed them once before in summer, but even then they were daunting. Would they have enough time before winter set in? Snow and ice would make the passes nearly impossible to traverse. What would happen if they were forced to bunker down on the mountain? The cart driver's whip cracked again, this time right next to Fate, making her jump. It was followed by a shrill yelp of pain. Fate opened her eyes. They were slow to adjust with the sun bearing down on her, and she shielded her face until she could see. There was an enormously rotund rabbit at the back of a cart he drove. His clothes were once of fine make, but very poorly maintained. A large stain was prominent down the front of what would otherwise have been a handsome doublet. The driver held a short whip of twisted leather, which he raised above his head, and tied to his cart were 4 small burrowlings. Fate, seeing this, went taut as a bowstring. One of the burrowlings, a small buck rabbit by the look of him, it was hard to tell with their emaciated features, had collapsed.
"You fool,"
spat the fat rabbit.
"You wait until we get to the very edge of town, and then you decide to quit pushing."
The boy tried to speak, but only a harsh croak came out.
"What's that? Speak when you're spoken to, boy,"
the fat rabbit said in a growing rage.
"Or perhaps you need some motivation."
The whip fell, this time striking one of the other burrowlings at the cart. A skinny doe rabbit gave a shrill cry and began to sob. The boy struggled vehemently in the dirt, reaching out towards the doe and trying to stand. They shared the same markings around their face and ears.
"Yes, I thought that'd get your attention,"
the fat rabbit said viciously.
"Get up, you worthless pile of fur,"
the driver spat.
"Worst purchase I've ever made."
Fate stood quickly, her paws balled into fist. She stared down the fat rabbit, and her muscles trembled as she tried to contain her rage. The fat rabbit glanced in her direction, eyeing her up and down.
"Hey there, Cottontail. Maybe you'd like to put on something later as well,"
he said with a greedy smile in her direction. The small buck had finally gotten to his feet again and leaned heavily upon the cart, placing himself between the small doe and the driver.
"Now that's better. Last time I ever buy from Weil, that cur,"
he fumed. The rabbit looked down at the small buck, shielding the doe with his body.
"Perhaps one more reminder."
The fat rabbit raised his arm again, the whip extended high over his head, and all the burrowlings cowered as a unit. A smooth sound of leather whispered, and a flash of steel blazed in the golden light. There was a soft, splattering sound, and a thud as something bonked the small buck softly on the shoulder, then dropped to the ground. A clenched paw, still grasping a leather whip, lay in the dirt. A piercing scream broke the silence of a moment before. The fat rabbit desperately clutched the stump of what used to be his paw. Fate stood poised between him and the cart. Her chest heaved violently, but her short sword was quite steady and extended towards the rabbit's enormous gut. The fat rabbit dropped to his knees and frantically tried to stymie the flow of blood from his arm.
"Run,"
Fate managed to bite out between clenched teeth. Her voice was heavy with emotion, and she willed herself not to slay the driver on the spot who kneeled in the dirt. Hurried footsteps sounded as Fletch appeared. He skidded to a halt beside the cart, with his paw tight upon Swan's hilt. A moment later, Felix joined them. Fletch's shirt of chainmail dangled from his grasp.
You coney,"
the fat rabbit gasped, his curse faltering in a wave of pain. He looked up. His watery eyes traveled past Fate's extended sword to her face, then to Fletch, and lastly they landed upon Felix. The rabbit's eyes widened behind his porky cheeks. His gaze fixated on the prince, and his complexion went pale. The fat rabbit mouthed wordlessly for a moment. Then he recoiled backwards in the dirt and struggled to his feet. Tripping in his haste, he started to run away as fast as his chunky frame would allow. A heartbeat passed. Everyone stood in silence.
You wool-headed,
Fletch hissed as he pulled the short sword from Fate. She didn't resist and let it go, then walked slowly towards a small fence at the side of the path. Fletch looked down at the burlings, whose attention was captivated by the severed paw. Fletch kicked the paw away into the ditch and began to cut the bonds that tied the burlings to the cart. "Felix," Fletch called, looking around for him. Felix was consumed in watching the back of the fat rabbit as he retreated into the distance. "Felix," Fletch snapped. "Huh?" Felix said, coming out of his stupor. "Do you remember how to get to Madame Jolin's from here?" Fletch asked as he gathered the small ones around. Yes," Felix replied after a stunned pause. "Good. Take these." Fletch pushed an armful of goods Fate had been watching into his paws. "And this," Fletch added as he reached into the cart the burlings had been pulling and extricated a large bottle of wine with a fine decorative label. "Listen, take the little ones to Jolin and give her that wine as payment. Tell her what has happened here and gather the rest of your gear. Can you do that?" Felix glanced at Fate standing to the side of the road and then back to Fletch. "Can you do that?" Fletch repeated more insistently. Felix swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. "Good, now go!" Fletch urged them away. The burlings were shocked, but did as they were told and followed Felix obediently. Fletch watched the group round the corner and pass out of sight. The fox's shoulders slumped under this new weight of burden, and he gazed idly into the depths of the cart. He reached down and took a rag from the cart, then looked towards Fate. She was standing stock still and clutching the rail of a small fence, so hard her knuckles showed through the fur on her paws. Fletch cleaned the blade of Fate's short sword with the rag and approached her slowly. Fate didn't move as Fletch came up beside her. She just stood, gazing out over a small personal garden attached to the back of a residence. "He was headed for the outer heed," Fletch said. "Yeah," Fate replied in a hollow voice. "They'll likely bring riders. We'll have to travel through the night," Fletch said, now examining the garden as well. "Yeah," Fate said softly. A pronounced silence fell. Fate and Fletch stood together as night insects began their soft songs. "Hey, Fletch." He intoned. "I want a garden," Fate said. Her voice was very far away. Fletch looked at Fate. Fate's eyes were damp, and her vision slightly blurred when she met his gaze. A long moment passed. Then Fletch reached for her paw. She let him take it, and he turned it over gently. Fletch cleared his throat. "Not yet," he said, and placed the hilt of her sword back into her paw.
Thank you for listening to this audio recording of Lightbearer by J.A. Hawk. If you enjoyed this production, consider supporting the author's work. Your support goes a long way in helping independent artists with projects like this one. Paperback copies of Lightbearer are now available for purchase through Amazon.com. And for readers who prefer a hardback version, they may be purchased through BarnesandNoble.com. Follow the links below or scan the QR code to pick up your copy of Lightbearer today.